mode rather than becoming colloquial, as would be more natural too. I should say, I was absolutely delighted to find that the conference had begun with Carl's excellent overview of the history of our field, because my starting point is that much of media and communication studies, as presently constituted, suffers from a drastically foreshortened historical perspective, the absence of which is all the more critical now as we enter the world of the digital. I argue that media studies needs to place contemporary developments, such as the constitution of cyberspace, in a much longer historical perspective. As we enter an era of digitalization, technical convergence, individualized and interactive media systems, all these issues become more urgent. As Len Spiegel has put it, the more we speak of futurology, the more we need to take a longer historical perspective. Or indeed, to put it another way, we could think back to James Carey's remarks on how, of course, the digital age properly begins in 1847 with the invention of the telegraph, rather than something that happened last Tuesday. We're often told that under the impact of the new technologies of our globalized age, we live in a borderless world characterized by unprecedented rates of mobility and by the experience of time-space compression resulting from the speed of communications and transport links. To that extent, it seems, we live in a brand new world of all-at-onceness, except, of course, it's a remarkably similar image to the one presented by Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s when he spoke of this global village of instantaneity. Certainly, new technologies and global cultural flows now transgress the boundaries around our nations, localities and homes. The media continue to flood us with images of unknown people and places, but we shouldn't mistake these media's reach for their power. They may be ubiquitous, but theirs is often a rather thin presence diluted by local contexts of reception. So for me, global cultural forms still have to be made sense of within the context of local forms of life. In some versions of the story of globalization, we are offered what I would characterize as an abstracted sociology of the postmodern, inhabited by an uninterrogated we who nowadays live in an undifferentiated global world. And moreover, the presumption is that we are all increasingly determined by the effects of the new media. Now this is the thing that puzzles me the most. In an awful lot of new media research, we seem to return to what is on the whole largely discredited theory of hypodermic effects. In some versions, it's a kind of utopian theory. The new media will somehow make us all more democratic. In some versions, it's a dystopian theory. The new media will rot our brains and fragment our children's consciousness and so on. But either way around, it's a matter of direct causality, which is extraordinary after 30 years of research which shows that technologies simply do not have effects in that way. It depends on how they are seen, how they are mobilized, how they are used by different people in different contexts. Crucially, to come to my title about contextualism, the issue is how a variety of media technologies, both new and old, are fitted into and come to function differently within a variety of different cultural contexts. Contextualism was an issue which Roger Silverstone and I discussed in the study in the late 80s. We derived the term from Jennifer Bryce, and she says the point is that from a contextualist perspective, rather than beginning with a technology and attempting to identify its essence by a process of philosophical reflection from which one will then deduce its effects, one should begin with the interactional cultural system into which a technology is going to enter and see how it is mobilized, how it comes into that particular system, and how it is understood by the people who inhabit that particular cultural world. So the argument is fundamentally against any notion of straightforward technological impacts, whether that's kind of bobo dolls and television violence causing violence, or whether it's the effects of the new media today. In relation to the broader questions of technology and context, my general point concerns the need to focus not on digitalization in general or on cyberspace in the abstract, but rather on the particular types of cyberspaces which are instituted in specific localities under particular cultural, economic and political circumstances. I think the work of Daniel Miller, along with the various collaborators that he's had in the recent period, is exemplary in that respect. He's produced studies of specifically how the internet functions in Trinidad, taking into account the fact that Trinidad is a society characterized by very high rates of emigration and a high preponderance of multi-site families. He's done work with Ed Horst, for instance, on the mobile phone in Jamaica. What happens when a technology with the specific affordances and capacities of a mobile phone enters a culture which is about talking, which is a very highly verbalized culture. It's a specific modality of mobile phone that you get there. So the question is context. To put it another way, Miller and his colleague Don Slater also did work in West Africa, where they were considering the pertinence of particular internet technologies in two different villages. In the first village, the village elders had managed to get from an international funding body a large amount of money. They got a purpose-built room, air-conditioned room, new banks of computers, high modem speeds, the whole thing. The only problem was that the hall where the computers were housed was slightly off the beaten track as far as the villagers were concerned. Conversely, in another village, an American volunteer from the Peace Corps left behind when he went home at the end of his term of service there a broken down old laptop which had a dodgy modem. It wasn't a very effective technology in the sense of capacity and effectivity, but he gave it to the owner of a cafe who he'd become friendly with, and the owner of the cafe put it on the table at the front of the cafe, and outside the cafe were the bus stop and the taxi stands where the villagers from miles around had to pass through to get to the big town. So guess what? The much lower grade technology which fitted into the established flow of mobility and communication in the culture had a much more profound effect than the very powerful technology which didn't properly articulate with the culture when it was being inserted. Now, I speak then of computers and I speak of taxis. I don't do that lightly. In fact, in my own work, I'm increasingly returning to a more classical 19th century definition of communications, which would include the question of transport and physical mobility. It will be about not simply the movement of information and images, but also the movement of persons and things. And the question is how these different things can be articulated. The specific question, perhaps in the context of this conference, is how we might better understand the articulation of the realm of the virtual in different material locations, because I think too much of the discussion of new media has imagined that what's going to happen is that cyberspace and virtual relations are simply going to substitute themselves for material relations. I think this is a complete misconception. What we have to understand is precisely the relationship, the virtual and the actual, of online and offline territories, as we might call it, in different contexts. Theories of globalization, as I've said, often emphasize the role of communications in time-space compression and what they call deterritorialization, leading to a virtual world in which it's sometimes claimed that geography is dead. And all of this is often attributed to the transformative effects of digital technologies which are supposedly making everything the same all over the world. I don't buy that. Coming from the kind of cultural studies tradition that I do, which prioritizes grounded theory over abstraction, that kind of one-size-fits-all kind of model just doesn't do anything for me. I'm not very interested in those general schemes. I'm much more interested, notwithstanding all the problems associated with it, with, in a way, a return to some of the traditions of area studies in which one pays more attention to the difference between the stories one would need to tell in different regions of the world, rather than imagine there's one big story we can tell about all of it. I know that lying behind that are real conceptual and methodological difficulties about how one defines a region without falling back into kind of geographical naturalism, but nonetheless that's the route I want to pursue. The other question that concerns me, and that I want to talk about a little bit, is the way, it's just a question of how new all this global mobility and technical change is. I mean, there's a book called The Shock of the Old by the Imperial College science writer David Edgerton, and his argument is that never mind all this talk of rapid change, that in relative terms ours is an age of technological stasis, that compared with the rate of technological change at the beginning of the 20th century, radio, cinema, photography, steamship, railroad, aeroplane, the changes we have been experiencing in recent years are relatively minimal. Yes, we can send more gigabytes attached to a particular bit of stuff on the internet, but compared with the difference that the telegraph made, it says nothing. Moreover, he says, most historians focus far too much on novelty, where actually it's always old technologies that continue to dominate our lives. Most research focuses on invention over use, acquisition over maintenance, and inevitability over choice. And his line is that all of those prioritizations are wrong, that what we need to be interested in is how technologies are used and by who, as they are transformed and reinvented in hybrid forms as they use shifts from one context to another. Moreover, as he points out, this is often a process of uneven development in which a technology may decline for a period in one place. Think of the decline of the bicycle in the West, in the rich West, yes? And then it reappears, and suddenly it's big in China, it's big in India. And then you go to Beijing, it's gone now, there's no more bicycles in Beijing. But of course the bicycle has come back in a new ecological mode in Amsterdam, London, Paris, as the transport technology of the future. So he alerts us to the fact that technological progress is not necessarily a one-way street, and that this kind of innovation-centered technological futurism is often misguided. Indeed, he points to areas of significant technological regression. If you were to look 30 years ago, there was an industry called shipbreaking, how you break down a ship when it's come to the end of its useful life. And it was a high-tech industry. Shipbuilding is now largely performed on the beaches of Bangladesh by armies of men using medieval instruments. It's gone radically backwards. Then, of course, he says, it's neither one thing nor the other. In lots of places throughout the 20th century, technologies that we think of as old, the donkey cart, the wooden plough, or whatever, have been maintained and used alongside the aeroplane and the motor car. We have to think, he says, about the question of symbiosis of old and new forms of technology in the media and communications field as elsewhere. At a broader level, he argues for another shift. He says, this perspective on technology in use will allow us to get away from what he calls the large-scale, spectacular, masculine, prestigious technologies of the rich white world, and to produce a truly global technical history, which features also the small-scale, mundane, feminized, and often creolized technologies of the shanty towns of the world, which often have developed novel systems of effective communication, which now sometimes surpass anything that's done in the West. You know, you think about the sophistication of mobile phone banking in some parts of Africa. It's way beyond what we've got in the rich West. If you go on a holiday to Thailand, what do you find? The tuk-tuk taxi, an extraordinary hybrid of different technologies, you know, the scooter mixed with the rickshaw. What he alerts us to is this world of mixture. Here I arrive at a difficult point in my argument, which I had not anticipated until Carl started talking about Daniel Learner. It took me back. I haven't thought about Learner since I was a student, and like Carl, when I was a student, Learner was just about to be back. But I'm going to have a problem in rethinking him, because a lot of my recent work has been influenced on the one hand by historians like Fernand Braudel, who insist on the notion of simultaneous different historical times. In the cultural studies tradition, Raymond Williams always said that in any one period you might have a dominant element but you've also got residual elements from the period before and emergent elements which might become dominant in the next period. So again, it's a very simple model. It's there's more than one thing. And I'm also very influenced by Bruno Latour's concept of how we have never been modern. The notion that we can become modern and discard the traditional realm of magic and superstition and all this thing is ludicrous. As Herman Balsinger has it, folk culture is alive and well in the world of technology. So there's a difficulty there about periodization, but I think a point that has to be pursued. But in terms of how we pursue it, as I say, I'm particularly disinterested in stories which tell us what technologies have done to us. And I'm particularly disinterested in stories about how we no longer have roots or origins, only aerials and terminals, as we are sometimes told. Again, that's Mackenzie Ward talking about the death of geography. One of the examples that's often used to persuade people that we live in a deterritorialized world is the growth of industries such as the so-called offshore telephone call centres, which, for instance, handle a lot of the customer services for British businesses. If I ring up and I want to find out what time is the train from London to Birmingham, I'm talking to someone in India. Okay. I don't think that it's proper to describe that as deterritorialization, that is re-territorialization. The call centre is not just anywhere, it is specifically in India because the history of the British Empire bequeathed India the unholy combination of a low level of wage costs and a high level of indigenous English language skills. It's exactly the same reason which explains why French or German call centres are in North Africa. This is not a process of deterritorialization, it is a process of re-territorialization. Moreover, cyberspace itself demonstrably has a very particular geography. I'm sure you've all seen those maps of the world at night where you can see where is lit up and where it isn't. You know, the internet is the same. If you trace the relative density of internet connections per square kilometre on the globe, it's the same as anything else. It's massively centralised. Massively centralised. Moreover, the internet industry itself and the dot-com industry, supposedly about deterritorialization, is one of the most centralized industries that exists. The dot-com industry is clustered very, very strikingly in particular areas of particular world cities. In London, if you're running a dot-com company, if you're not in Shoreditch, you're sunk. That's the only place you can be. The whole San Francisco boom starts in one particular part of downtown Bay Area, San Francisco. And you have to be there because that's where the networks are. That's where the capital is. That's where you can get references from people who've known people long enough for you to make a huge gamble of millions of pounds on this guy's capacity as a programmer, which is what you're doing. You've got to be there. You have to be in the street. The geography matters enormously. You've got to meet them coming out of the cafe just at the right moment when the new deal has come through. And of course, all of this still depends on very old technologies. I mean, the most striking example, perhaps, was the moment when I went to Australia a few years ago, only to discover that the whole internet was down across Australia and Australasia for about 4 days. For the simple reason that a ship in the harbour in Alexandria had banged its keel on the undersea cable that still runs all the way through the through the Mediterranean, across the Indian Ocean. It was built to run the ministry of the British Empire. The internet still depends on those cables. All that, I think, is a very common phenomenon, that the ghosts of history reappear again and again in this new technologies. If you look at what's happening at mobile phone networks in Slovenia and Croatia, they're reinventing what were the provinces of the Habsburg Empire. The boundaries are the same, they're just transformed now into markets rather than simple political boundaries. So, I'm interested in the mixture of the virtual and the actual, the particular way they're mixed together in different circumstances. I'm interested in the mobility of people and things as well as messages. And I'm influenced by what in Britain is called the new mobilities paradigm, developed by people like John Owen and his colleagues in the sociology department at Lancaster. But, as one of the contributors to the Mobility Journal says, if mobility is everything, then it is nothing. Talking about a culture of speed or a mobile society, it's half the story. Nobody talks about the obverse of speed, which is the culture of waiting, which is of course the fate of the poor, of anybody who hasn't got the qualifications that give them access to the fast track lane at the airport or the pay-as-you-go lane on the motorway or whatever it is, you know. If you look at Sao Paulo, the middle classes there increasingly meet their mobility needs by helicopter from the roofs to and fro their offices and their apartments. But their maids are travelling 4 or 5 hours each way on a very slow bus from the favelas where they live. If you look at the world of illegal migration, it can take a year for an illegal Chinese migrant to get from China to Canada because the route crucially involves waiting and hiding at various key points for weeks and sometimes months at a time. It's what Doreen Massey talks about as what she calls the power geometry of contemporary mobility and connexity. It's a geometry to which we have to pay close attention rather than making any huge generalizations about the tendency of the technology. And let me then end just with some, I want to develop it back just a little way further to attend, rather obviously in a context such as this, to the question of Eurocentrism and the extent to which interpretive paradigms, again a big story about what is really the story of the West, the theories of the West, the way they've been imported wholesale and applied elsewhere without being appropriately tailored to local situations. I don't mean to argue for some kind of indigenous authenticity stuff where if you're in Egypt you can only use ideas developed in Egypt, and if you're in Finland you can only use ideas developed in Finland, and whatever else. Ideas travel, they properly travel. But most Western theory is self-absorbed and parochial, and the universalistic theories of the media developed there, as people like John Downing and James Cameron have argued, are often produced on the basis of evidence derived from the same few Euro-American settings. So supposedly universal models of media development are, as they say, unduly influenced by the experience of a very few untypical countries. And it is indeed absurd to universalize the particular experience of places such as the USA and Britain as if those affluent, stable democracies with their Protestant histories and their imperial entanglements could possibly be seen as representative of the world at large. In relation to which, I take great heart from some of the things that are happening in the world of anthropology. I think media anthropology, and what's now been coming to the term digital anthropology, is one of the most interesting contemporary developments that there is. And to take one example, I'm particularly interested in the work of the anthropologist in New York called Brian Larkin, who sets himself the project of figuring out what media theory would look like if instead of starting from the presumptions of New York, you started from the presumptions of the northern Nigerian city of Kano and looked at what technologies, infrastructures and whatever could be taken for granted there. His interest in where the insights of Western media theory have force and where their analytic presumptions turn out to be culturally specific rather than based on any essential properties of the technologies which they claim to speak about. So what Larkin tries to do is to use the Nigerian experience to defamiliarize our presumptions and reveal the particularity of what goes without saying. One example he uses is a very simple one. He takes the different significance of an electrical blackout in Kano as opposed to New York. In New York, electricity goes down. It's a major crisis. People talk about it for years after when the lifts got stuck. In Kano, it's a thing that happens most days. You know, people have got a spare generator. It's very annoying. The fuel is very expensive, so sometimes when the power goes down, they can't afford to put the generator on. But on the whole, it's a practical business. It's not a kind of huge crisis. And of course, Western media theory routinely assumes the universal availability of well-functioning technological infrastructures and all the rest of it. Whereas the people of the mega slums of the cities which represent the actual future of the world, Lagos, Mumbai or whatever, are living in a very different world of everyday technological improvisation, developing fragile and flexible local networks, given, of course, the complete unreliability, as they experience it, of all structural forms of provision. So, to argue all of this, and here I end, is simply to recognise that, empirically speaking, the assumed truths of media studies only pertain to media operating within very particular types of socio-cultural, legal and economic frameworks. Go back to the question of contextualism with which I begin. My argument is that we need to be more sensitive to the very many ways in which different contexts produce different media cultures. So, in relation to the dynamics of the global variations in what has been called post-broadcast era, Graham Turner and Ginettei, in their new edited collection of materials deriving initially from Australia, talk about how easy it is to get carried away by the overwhelming trends in Western markets. We talk about the similarity of those markets, encouraging Western scholars to underestimate the contingency of the relations between television, nation and culture to which they are accustomed. And they say, we should abandon what they call the default settings of Anglo-American television studies and shift its focus so as to better recognise the extent to which local, national and regional histories still determine the contemporary development of the global media. And that also involves recognising the variety of platforms, formats and distinctive cultural forms in play in different geolinguistic markets. And above all, it recognises that not all of them are developing in the same direction, let alone at the same rate as the Western media, on which most of our theoretical models are based. And so, to that extent, they argue, and I think rightly, we should resist any siren calls to extrapolate a universalised answer about the question of the technological future from the development of the contemporary West. Thank you.